This discussion over what level of government is responsible for public education in the United States ultimately leads to the question of, well, how do we fund our public education? The short answer is, it comes from a variety of places and from all levels of government. Historically, local property taxes drove a significant share of education funding. Today it accounts for about 2/5 of all school funding in the United States. What could be problematic about property taxes and school funding? Think about it for a second. Consider poor areas and rich areas, or houses that are worth a lot versus houses that are worth less. When you think about the two, houses that are worth more, ultimately you can exact more in property taxes from them compared to their less affluent counterparts. Thus, what's the implications of this? Poor areas ultimately have less resources because they have less of a tax base from their property, whereas more affluent areas have greater resources because they have more tax funding coming in because their properties are worth more. Ultimately, this means that there's disparities between the rich and the poor districts in terms of funding for their schools. Beyond this, the state governments contribute a significant share of funding to their public education. Today, they contribute about half of school funding. Yet this varies across the states, as every state is different in terms of how much they are willing and capable to input into their school system. Beyond this, the federal government puts a minor amount of money into the school system through specific grants and federal programs. Think back to the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Many of these grants and federal programs are very specific and tailored to certain things that a school district may need, be it textbooks or improvements to infrastructure. Looking at these three levels of funding overall, what does it tell us? Ultimately, there's going to be disparities in education determined by the resources that are available. Thinking back to the start of this module, remember, all children have access to education, but what about the quality of that education? As we can imagine, there are a stream of policy issues and concerns stemming solely from the funding of our educational system. One significant issue stemming from funding for K-12 education is the lack of buoyancy in property taxes. Buoyancy is when taxes rise along with cost. Think about this for a second. Costs for education in general go up. Things like textbook, teacher salaries, and even costs to run a school, be it heat, electricity, water. However, we don't like taxes. In particular, we don't like property taxes. As such, taxes aren't growing along with the cost of education. Taxes are often held flat by local governments because we don't like taxes and will exact electoral retribution upon those politicians that do want to raise them. Further, in states that use direct democracy, citizens have actually put in place limits on how much taxes can actually go up. This essentially hog-ties their local governments when they do need to raise taxes to fund their educational system. Because of this difficulty in the local funding mechanism, states have stepped up and started to provide some more resources. Remember, right now about 50% of public education is funded at the state level. However, historically this was much more. What would explain this decrease in how much we're funding our educational system? A lot of the blame goes back to the various economic recessions and downturns we've experienced historically. As budgets were strained during these economic downturns, we cut from public education. However, when the economy went north again, we failed to return much of that funding back to our educational system. Together, this lack of funding has led to an equity issue in terms of the quality of education for our students. While much attention has been given to disparities between rich and poor and black and minority and white areas, one area which doesn't get much attention is the disparity between urban and rural education. Much of our resources often flow into the urban and suburban areas, yet we forget about the rural areas. Think back to the prior module where you looked at poverty in the United States. Some of the most poor areas in the country tend to be our rural areas. Further, rural areas tend to have less people per area, or per square mile. Ultimately, this means less students. And when you think about the cost to educate per pupil, well, that's not as much money going into the school districts. The issues that arise from equity are thus related to quality. Ultimately, when we go to evaluate quality, we think about the output from our educational system. In particular, we evaluate the decline in academic performance. We hear about declining graduation rates, as well as reading and STEM scores. We hear about the United States in comparison to the rest of the world. And further, we hear about gaps in race, economic status, disability, and even gender. Further, we hear about disparities in the quality of teachers. How do we evaluate them? Are they just teaching to the test? And we hear it from the other side as well, from the teachers, about low salaries. How do we motivate people to want to become teachers and teach in these environments? Clearly, there are issues that the K-12 education system faces that we must address.